what's more dangerous than a teenager with a cigarette? A teenager with a book. Especially when that book is The Catcher in the Rye. It is widely known that in the US, Salinger's most famous novel was banned from schools and accused of corrupting young minds. However, on the other side of the ocean, in the Soviet Union, its fate was not much better since it had to go through censorship, and what came out on the other side wasn't exactly Holden Caulfield, it was his oddly polite Soviet cousin. Hello and welcome to Read Less. My name is Armen Zakharyan, and today we're talking about a novel that managed to offend people on both sides of the Iron Curtain, just for different reasons. The Catcher in the Rye is one of the most influential books of the 20th century, a novel that speaks in a teenage voice. It was first published in 1951, and soon it was banned and blamed for everything, from teenage rebellion to moral decay. But it was also loved fiercely by generations of readers who saw themselves in Holden Caulfield, a 16-year-old boy walking the streets of New York, grieving, lying, laughing, desperate to find something real in a world that feels fake and phony. The Catcher in the Rye doesn't offer you an incredible plot twist or dramatic resolution. There's no character arc that ends in redemption, but that's the main point. The book itself refuses to behave, just like its protagonist. It's messy, sarcastic, and full of digressions, like the famous "where the ducks go when the lake gets all frozen" quote. At the same time, it's a deeply sad novel about the moment you realize that childhood is over, but there's nothing ready yet to replace it. And Salinger delivers all of that. The grief, the anger, the loneliness, the strange hope, etc., mostly not through events or clever metaphors, but through Holden's voice. That's the real feature of the book. It's not just about a teenager, no, it sounds like one. Full of half-finished thoughts, weird expressions, exaggerations, slang, repetition, obscenities. And even when he lies to others and to himself, somehow, in all that mess, you find that he's uncomfortably honest. More honest, at least, than the world of adults that is eager to teach him how he must behave. That is why translating The Catcher in the Rye is such a challenge. You have to deliver Holden's unique voice in a different language that doesn't have the same slang, the same rhythm, or the same cultural references. It's a translator's nightmare because you're carrying across the mood. You have to recreate the illusion of a boy talking directly to the reader, impulsive and alive. And that brings us to the Russian translation, to Soviet censorship, and to Rita Wright-Kovaleva. She was one of the most respected Soviet translators. She brought Faulkner to the Russian reader, and later Vonnegut. She was considered to be one of the best translators from English into Russian. So, when in 1960 she translated The Catcher in the Rye, her version became the definitive one for generations of Russian-speaking readers across the globe. What could possibly go wrong, you wonder? Well, quite a bit of things, actually. You see, the Soviet publishing was strictly controlled. Even respected translators worked under the gaze of editorial boards, cultural committees, and wide censorship system. Every Soviet translator knew that there are sometimes invisible and sometimes quite clearly drawn lines you could not cross, not without consequences at least. So, translators learned to navigate and to soften. Rita Wright-Kovaleva, brilliant as she was, had no choice but to play by those rules. So her Holden Caulfield had to be adjusted. Where the original was vulgar and emotional, the translated was at least careful. And where Holden swore, joked, or sounded like a horny, confused 16-year-old, the Russian version often sounded like a grammar school student writing a very emotional but very correct essay. You see, Holden didn't just speak Russian. No, he had to speak Soviet. So let's dive into examples and find out how exactly Holden Caulfield's narrative was censored back in the USSR. For instance, the Soviet translation of The Catcher in the Rye is quite literally full of lunatics. First, Holden says, "I took off my hat so they wouldn't think I was a lunatic." Then he checks into a hotel full of lunatics, and later looks out the window to see what all the lunatics were doing there. That's a lot of lunatics, suspiciously many, so many that you start wondering whether you're still in New York or in a Gogol short story. But here's the thing, for as many as a dozen lunatics, that's how often you find this word in the Soviet translation, in the original, Salinger uses half a dozen different words. Holden talks about bastards, perverts, morons, and flits. But you see, this kind of language was considered offensive in the moral and ideological sense. So what do you do with a character like Holden Caulfield who spends half the novel insulting people? Well, by the way, not really insulting. He's a teenager, and that is simply his way to describe the world around himself, to reflect upon the world, but that's not the point right now. So, in order to avoid this kind of language that might be perceived as offensive by the censorship, you soften it a little and make him repeat the same harmless word, lunatic, again and again, no matter whether he's talking about a criminal, a drunk, or someone just acting weird on a bus. The most telling change here has to do with the word flit. It was 1940s American slang for a gay man. Offensive, yes, but specific. Remember, that's how Holden talks. When he says, "The other end of the bar was full of flits," he's being a teenage boy from a rather conservative time and place. It might feel uncomfortable, but it's true. Now, in the Soviet translation, that line goes like this: "The other end of the bar was full of lunatics." You see, the entire social meaning is gone, vanished. But why? Well, because in the USSR, homosexuality was illegal. It was a crime. It was officially considered a psychiatric disorder. And most importantly, it was a taboo. Gay people were systematically excluded from public life, and that meant they had to be excluded from the language as well. You couldn't talk about them in books, in films, in schools, in songs, not even to condemn them. Because in a society that pretends something doesn't exist, even mentioning it becomes a threat. So when Holden says flits and the translator gives us lunatics, it's not just about softening the insult. It's about obeying an unspoken but very clear rule. These people must not appear. Queerness was not allowed to exist as a category of existence, of identity, not even as a background character in a bar in the US. Let me be clear. The Soviet school of translation wasn't always like this. There are exceptions, of course. It's not that every trace of homosexuality or queerness was automatically erased in every book. No. For example, in Volume 4 of In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust, the theme of homosexuality is present and translated faithfully in accordance with the original. But, and it's a very big objection, how many readers were going to make it through the salons and the soirées and sentences that last for pages just to reach this same-sex desire theme in the 4th volume? That's one point. But there's also another. Even Proust was published with a, let's say, protective frame. The Soviet edition of In Search of Lost Time opened with an introductory article, a kind of ideological disclaimer, which reassured the reader that, yes, Proust does depict homosexuality, but only in the spirit of cold, objective analysis. According to the author of that introduction, Proust was not exploring queerness with empathy or understanding. Oh, no. He was performing a kind of clinical dissection, a detached observer, not a participant. In other words, Don't worry, comrade reader, these are not real people. This is not real life. This is a sickness from the French salon from the beginning of the century, and by the way, the author disapproves. Which of course was a one-sided interpretation that was simply not true, but it helped Proust to be published in the first place. Because without such a disclaimer, this book would simply not be allowed in print in the USSR. But The Catcher in the Rye was a different kind of problem. Let's be honest, The Catcher in the Rye was not Proust. It was supposed to be one of the most loved books of Soviet youth, a novel about teenagers for teenagers. And that's exactly why it had to be cleaned up. Because if there's one thing Soviet ideology took seriously, it was the proper education of the younger generations. And by proper, I mean propaganda, of course. But let's move on. It wasn't just about queerness for Soviet censorship. Everything Holden said about sex, and as you might imagine, a 16-year-old boy thinks about sex a lot, was softened, rounded off, replaced, or quietly removed. Take this line from the original. He knew quite a bit about sex, especially perverts and all. In the translation, it becomes, he knew a lot about that kind of stuff, especially about all those lunatics. Gone is the word sex, gone is the word perverts, gone is any reference to desire, misbehavior, or ambiguity. Holden, it seems, knows something about some vague things. Here's another example. Salinger writes, "You don't always have to get too sexy to get to know a girl." The Soviet version, "You don't necessarily have to flirt with the girl to get to know her." Get too sexy becomes flirt. An example that, in my view, speaks for itself. And this wasn't an isolated move. Across the novel, the pattern repeats again and again. In the original text, there are around 40 uses of words with the root sex. In the Soviet translation, only 5 in the entire book. Then again, perhaps that's even generous. After all, as the joke went, there was no sex in the Soviet Union, but in the Soviet translation, there was 5 times. In a way, that's progress. Now let's move on to other examples. Sometimes Soviet censorship was carefully managing geopolitical friendships. In one of the scenes in The Catcher in the Rye, Holden walks into a bar and sees 2 drunken guys. One of them is described as a very Cuban-looking guy who breathes alcohol fumes directly into Holden's face. Seems like a harmless moment, right? But in reality, that was diplomatically problematic, because by that time, in the Soviet Union, Cuba wasn't just a country, it was a symbol. The revolution had triumphed. Fidel was giving speeches. Soviet engineers were arriving to the island of freedom, as Cuba was then called. So, it was the new little brother in the socialist family, and no little brother of Marx would be caught drunk in a bar. So, what do you do if your source text has a Cuban man smelling of rum and breathing into the protagonist's face? Simple. You quietly turn him into a Spaniard. That's how, in the Soviet translation, the very Cuban-looking guy becomes a real Spaniard by appearance. Why a Spaniard? Well, for one, it's close enough. To the untrained eye of a Soviet citizen who rarely had the permission to leave the country, so who's going to argue? But more importantly, Spain was politically safe. By that time, it was ruled by a dictator, Francisco Franco. The Soviet Union had no diplomatic relations with Franco's Spain. So portraying a Spaniard as a drunk and breathing alcohol on a teenager, perfectly acceptable. This little switch tells you everything you need to know about how Soviet translation worked. The goal wasn't just to render the original meaning, it was to maintain the moral and political hygiene on the page. And then there were, of course, the cuts, the quietest form of censorship, because there were also parts of The Catcher in the Rye that simply, well, disappeared, vanished somewhere between the English manuscript and the Soviet printing press. Let's be fair, we're not talking about the same scale as in, say, Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, where entire chapters were sometimes lost in translation. But even in a novel as relatively compact as Salinger's, things had a tendency to go missing. Take chapter 25, the famous scene where Holden takes his little sister Phoebe to the zoo. They stop to look at the bears. Holden describes two of them. Only one bear came out, the white, polar one. The other one, the brown one, was still in his crazy cave and wouldn't come out. All you could see was his rear end. But in the Soviet translation, you really couldn't, because that line is gone. The polar bear comes out, the brown bear hides. His rear end, nowhere to be found. Okay, is this a big deal? Well, of course no. Does it fundamentally change the story? No, for sure. But that's the point. This wasn't a case of ideological danger. This was simply stylistic sanitation. A bear's rear end in 1960s Soviet literature was simply a bit too much. Not obscene, but unnecessary. So we get rid of it. And when you start looking for these moments, you find them all over the place, because the logic of Soviet censorship wasn't just about suppressing what was wrong, it was also about thinking of what was proper, elevated, respectable. And finally, let's talk about one of the iconic moments in the book, the FU words on the wall. Holden sees those two words scratched into the wall of a school, a place for children, and it hits him hard, so he tries to rub them out, but he can't. Now, translating the FU in the USSR was quite a challenge. You can't just directly translate it, you can't even imply it. So, the Soviet translation of this phrase reads like this: someone had written something obscene on the wall. Obscene. It's a smart solution, a graceful one. You see, Wright Kovaleva doesn't pretend it wasn't obscene. She just politely closes the door before we can read it. But in doing so, the whole weight of the moment shifts. Because what Holden sees in that hallway isn't just something obscene, it's something very specific. But in the translation, it becomes an abstraction, an idea. You lose the sharpness. What remains is a literary echo of the moment, respectable, clean, and harmless. So what do we have in the end? We have a book that was supposed to sound like a teenager and ended up sounding a bit like a teacher. We have a narrator who swears, stumbles, lies, and somehow in Soviet Russian becomes a confused but manageable young man who says lunatic a lot and thinks flirting is a good way to get to know a girl. But maybe the most fascinating thing is that despite all this, the euphemisms, the omissions, the redaction, the book still worked. Soviet readers loved it, quoted it, grew up with it. Not exactly with the Holden Caulfield Salinger created, but with a Holden they could reach. And that tells us something strange and kind of beautiful. That voice of a great book indeed is fragile, but it is also persistent. You can censor it, smooth it out, and still, if the pulse is strong enough, it leaks through. Like the ducks from the frozen lake, you think they've gone, but they're just waiting somewhere off the page for the ice to melt. Thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like, share it, send it to someone who loves literature as much as we do here. We'll be back soon with more stories about books that survived impossible things. Books that were misunderstood, misread, mistranslated, and still made it through. And until then, call me Armin, and I'll see you next time.